Welcome back to the Living Lands podcast. Today is episode 3, where we talk with Peter Levi, a freshwater ecosystem ecologist who works at the Burke Center at Northland. Peter has also spent time as an associate professor of environmental science and sustainability at Drake University. Peter's research focuses on how changes to lakes, streams, and reservoirs have cascading impacts on other processes within these ecosystems. He has done research on and in water from the Laurentian Great Lakes to Denmark, Alaska, and Ghana. His undergraduate degree is from Lawrence University, and his graduate degree is from the University of Notre Dame. Peter, it's great to have you on. I'm glad to see you again.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. It's great to see you, and thanks for the invitation to contribute to the podcast.
So I brought you on because you have a unique perspective that a lot of people don't have, and that is the water resources. And you're the water guy, and you were at Drake, and you surely are at Northland as well. And I just kind of want to talk to you about water. Why should we care about water resources, and how do they play into land and how land is valued or conserved? So talk to me a little bit about what projects you have going on right now, and maybe what you've studied over the past few years and where we're at with all of that.
Yeah, fantastic, Sam. It's hard to think about where to start when it comes to water. I've given a lot of talks and taught a lot of classes and done some outreach. And if I were to start somewhere, is just that water is truly essential for life, right? We are dependent on it. Our bodies are primarily water. When NASA is searching for extraterrestrial life, one of the primary things they're looking for is the presence of water, because all life that we know of needs water to survive. Of course, there could be other crazy forms of life that we haven't conceived of yet that maybe don't need water. But
maybe that's for our next episode.
Yeah, maybe the extraterrestrial bit is you need some astronomer on here. But so water really is essential for life. And we have water quality and water quantity issues that are imposing social pressures, economic pressures, and ecological and environmental pressures on the systems that provide this water. So those systems are groundwater, surface water, which can include lakes, streams, wetlands, rivers, and then of course the ocean as well, which is pretty salty, but there's some technology that's looking to make desalinization more affordable and more energy effective. So we have a lot of water on this planet, but the distribution of it, where it is on the planet relative to where people are, and then the quality of it are some major issues that are facing society.
So before we dive into those issues, can you talk to me a little bit about how you got into water and where the passion for water resources and all of those things started?
Gosh, where did I get into water? That's
maybe you've always been into water.
A good question. I think so. I'm a native Wisconsinite, and we're fortunate to have water. I do know how I got into streams and rivers, and now working back in Wisconsin, I'm working in lakes again as well. Growing up in Wisconsin, I didn't realize how fortunate we were to have so many lakes. You drive down a highway, you drive out into the country, and it's not uncommon to drive by several lakes. And then especially as you go further north in Wisconsin, you'll see dozens of lakes on a single drive. And that was just something that I took for granted. And, once I learned more about the science and thought more about water, we're really fortunate in the upper Midwest, this part of the United States that was glaciated 10,000, 15,000 years ago. The glaciers covered this area. And as they receded, they really impacted the landscape. And part of that was leaving behind, big chunks of ice that would then melt and form kettle lakes, or gouging out the landscape to form depressions that would then fill with water. So the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, is a really water-rich part of our country, largely because of the landscape dynamics that have formed the lakes here. So as I was finishing up my undergraduate degree, I realized how sort of geographically specific lakes are. They are only in these parts of the world where there were glaciers, or other processes have occurred. Like, for instance, in East Africa, there's some tectonic lakes because of the East African rift that are two continental plates pulling apart, creating depressions there. And those are some amazing Great Lakes in East Africa. But I digress. There aren't very many places where lakes are as abundant as the upper Midwest. And so I realized pretty early on that if I wanted to study water anywhere, I should study streams and rivers, because anytime you're on the landscape, you're in a watershed. So that really got me thinking about how the land around water bodies can impact it. Thinking about the watershed approach, and knowing then that I could do research anywhere, as you described in my introduction. I've done research in some pretty far-fetched places and have been fortunate to travel as part of my research. There are rivers and streams everywhere around the world, though lakes are more limited in their distribution.
Sure. So you actually wrote and contributed to a paper talking about the ecosystem responses to channel restoration. And I attempted to read this paper. It's somewhat hard to find online, but I was able to find some previews of it. And from the abstract, it looks like you guys looked at different streams and levels of streams, and then what restoration efforts were done to those. And then you kind of tried to figure out where the golden area is to restoring streams to make the largest impact on the watershed. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. We were looking at stream restorations in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So these were all tributaries to Lake Michigan. And we were interested in trying to inform management decisions with ecological science. So restoration ecology is a big field right now. There are millions, if not billions of dollars being poured into the business, I would say, of restoration, right? And so human land use, whether that's urban land use or agricultural land use, has changed the quality and quantity of water on the landscape. And so there are efforts to undo some of that impact by trying to restore more natural systems. So in Milwaukee, a lot of streams were channelized into concrete channels about 50 years ago. And the idea was that would prevent localized flooding by shunting the water off of the landscape quicker and get it downstream into the lake as fast as possible. But in effect, it had the opposite impact, in that it caused more flooding, because water was moving so quickly, and these banks these concrete channels would overfill, flooding the neighborhoods around the river. And there was also loss of life associated with these channels, because the water was moving so fast, and they were pretty deep if there was a spring rain or spring snowmelt. And so these concrete channels became public safety hazards, and of course were not natural by any means, right? Just having a river that was once free flowing and then slowly constricted as people developed the area to then put it lined in concrete was not natural at all. So there were a lot of efforts being done in the Milwaukee area to undo that. And so they were restoring streams into more sinuous, natural channels, and then planting riparian vegetation, or plants on the side of the stream that were native plants to the region. The idea there being that those roots of the plants would hold onto the soil, and then put in different types of rocks, small, everything from sand to pebbles to gravel to boulders, to try to just make it a more varied stream bottom, much as natural streams are.
So, in our last episode on the podcast, we talked about native plants and how native plants have something called a C value, which is basically a conservatism value, kind of indicates rarity and quality of the plant to some level. It's a bit categorical and vague at the moment, but it's being researched and expanded upon. And so when you talk about restoring native plants to the stream bank, are there specific plants that are that we need to be looking at restoring more of on the stream banks, or is it just any plant that's native that has deep roots? Where do you make that line? And I know you're a water guy, but obviously there are
Mhm.
aquatic plants, and those play a huge role in freshwater ecosystems. So talk to me a little bit about that.
I think what we found from our research regarding, I can speak more to like the connection between the ecosystem on the stream banks and the stream ecosystem itself. And some of our recent work in Iowa that I hope to publish soon as well demonstrates that streams with more closed canopy, so trees that are shading the stream, lead to healthier streams when assessed, when stream health is assessed as how much productivity or algal growth there is within the stream. So as you can imagine, in agricultural areas or urban areas, often these streams are getting a lot more sunlight if there aren't trees in the stream banks. And so I found in some Iowa work that simply having a forest, what they sometimes refer to as a gallery forest, gallery being that it's along the stream, so also referred to as the riparian area along the stream, that by having a forest there provides enough shade to limit the algal growth within the stream and therefore create a more healthy ecosystem.
Gotcha.
So too much algae is not good for streams, right? It's rare that you would see a natural stream with, that's green on the entire stream bottom, and long hair-like algae growing on the rocks. That's not natural, unhealthy, but it's something that we see pretty commonly in areas that have been disturbed by humans.
So I'll
Yeah.
speak to that a little bit. In my backyard, actually, I have a type 1 stream. It's within a mile of the start, basically, of classifying it as a stream. And
Mm-hmm.
I did a little post on this on Instagram about a year ago, 2 years ago now, actually, where I basically looked at the whole map for the stream. And we're at the very top, goes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, but through its connections, 1,800 or so miles of total stream. And I'm at the very top, and right now it's green and it's full of algae and has virtually no flow. So when you think of what your research kind of showed you, and then you see something like this, like it has a little bit of a forest, along the riparian zone, but it's not fully closed canopy. It's a lot of algae growth. It's really low flow. There's a beaver upstream. So there's certainly some things leading to it, being that way. To kind of talk me through your initial thought process of like, all right, this is the situation. Here's how we're going to assess or evaluate the next steps. Because I'm very curious about hearing from a freshwater ecologist instead of just like a generic engineer or habitat manager like myself who may have a different perspective on it.
Yeah, great question, Sam. So I thought of a few things. So I just made some notes there. For one, you bring up the watershed concept again. So the way that I like to think about a watershed is if you think about a bathtub, right? You turn that shower on and water might spray all over the bottom of the bathtub. And that bathtub you can think about as a landscape. And all that water goes to one location, and that's the drain. And so on a natural landscape, those drains are, as you said, those headwater streams, those first order streams that then connect to other larger streams. So I sometimes use, my hand or something too, to demonstrate how if you have smaller streams, they all come together into a larger stream, and then a larger stream still as they flow downhill via gravity. So you mentioned that your headwater stream is full of algae, and the results of our paper from 2020 demonstrated that where we saw the most impact of restoration was in those small streams. And as you went down the watershed, there was less difference between the restored stream and a concrete channel. At every location in that study, we had 6 locations. There was an upstream, downstream, restored channel, and concrete channel. So we could do some direct comparisons. So you hit on a really good point that the best place to really work on streams for broader water quality and water quantity improvement would be those headwaters. There are, even though headwaters are small, you can probably jump across yours.
Yep.
Maybe. They're small, but in a watershed, they make up the majority of stream miles. The majority of distance are these headwater streams. So if you think, you brought up the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is huge. It's the fourth largest river in the world. It includes parts or all of 32 states and 2 Canadian provinces. So it's a really big watershed. But if you want to think about water quality in the Mississippi, you really got to start working back up into the watershed, into these smaller streams. And the most miles, as I just said, of any stream size in the Mississippi River watershed would be those small streams like the one in your backyard. The reason that those are likely the best place to start is that you can manage them a little more easily, right? You can plant trees along the side. That's going to have a near immediate impact on that algae. Streams are receiving inputs from the landscape all the time, right? They're intimately connected with the lands around them. Another reason I find them fascinating to study. And because of that, it might not just be the amount of shade that a stream has alone that dictates how much algae is there, right? So another big input that could influence the amount of algae would be how much nutrients does the stream receive, either nitrogen or phosphorus, the same things we use to fertilize the landscape, whether it's your garden, your lawn, or at the agricultural scale, industrial fertilizer use. Those same things that help plants grow on the land also help algae grow in the water. So you can have a stream that's fully covered with trees, but there still might be algae if there's a lot of nutrients, right? So it's always, as with anything in environmental science, it's multifaceted, but there's usually a main driver, right? Is it the amount of sun that the stream is receiving? Is it the amount of nutrients? And if you can start to pull one lever, you can see how the stream responds.
So one problem, and I'm kind of using this stream in my backyard as like a case study for how restoration efforts can be done and the different impacts that certain steps of restoration efforts could have on the stream. And one thing I found is I have a pretty significant population of invasive species like hedge apple and pear that kind of follow along the stream channel. And so, the restorationist in me wants to remove the invasive species, but is it possible that the shade and the stream bank stabilization that the roots of these invasive species are providing is potentially more valuable than the invasive species removal? Or should I focus on other things in between that invasive species removal until that becomes the next step? I'm just very curious on how you would address that process.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thinking about what is the best thing to have along your stream bank. And I know on the one hand, you're right that any tree or shrub or plant, whether invasive or not, is going to provide some soil retention, right? The root system will hold onto the soil. So if you do get a rain storm or higher flow through your stream, even if the water goes above the banks, your banks would likely be more stable thanks to that vegetation. The downside of some invasive species when along a stream bank is in areas where where drought is just a common part of a 12-month cycle, right? So I know in Kansas and places, kind of in the Great Plains of the United States, not areas as water rich as the upper Midwest. And so that's primarily groundwater and then some rain, though not as much rain as here in the upper Midwest as well. And so some invasive plants are not adapted to an area with less water like the Great Plains. And so therefore, if they're growing along a stream, they're actually going to be pumping water out of the stream through their biological processes, right? So all plants need water to photosynthesize. And so this problem is especially acute in the Southwest, in the US Southwest and the high desert. there are invasive species that are growing along some of those streams, and they are pumping the water out of the streams, and then plants all transpire. Through the process of photosynthesis, they're losing water vapor through their leaves. As they take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, water could be lost. And so this creates a real problem in areas that water isn't quite as bountiful as here, that if you have an invasive species that needs a lot of water, but you're in a drier area, they're going to dry up your stream. So I can't speak specifically to the trees you mentioned, but if you're noticing low to no flow, I'd be really curious, because it is springtime. Streams are typically flowing in the spring. Mm-hmm. I'd be curious how much water those trees are pulling out of the stream bank. And therefore, the stream could be losing water into the stream bank, and then the trees are pulling the water up through the soil. So
I'm really glad you bring that up, actually, because I didn't know in some circumstances that they would actually have that significant of an effect. I've been talking to my wife about it, and I thought last year and even the year before that the stream flow was a bit higher this time of year. And I've felt like we've had a little bit more precipitation so far this year than we did in the past couple of years, besides just some occasional torrential downpours. That could potentially be playing a role into it. I didn't know that some plants could do that. So that would be an interesting study to see, what the average flows are before and then average flows are after maybe the removal of those species, just to kind of get a sense for it. And obviously, one location along the stream can't do it all, but at least it provides some context or some contribution to a understanding, right?
Yeah.
So, with your research that you did on this paper, were there specific restoration efforts that you found to be more impactful or to have a higher return on the quality for the stream than others?
Yeah, I measured quite a few different metrics. Some of them were physical metrics. How long does water stay in the reach? So we think about that. We refer to that as residence time, right? How long is the water within the stream reach? So as you can imagine, in a concrete channel, the water is just moving straight through. So it has very little residence time. Whereas when they created these natural stream restorations, again, they made sure the streams were sinuous, and they had a variety of rocks and rock types in the stream bottom. And so that created eddies, it created backwater pools, it created some riffle points, but then again, another pool there. And so these are all areas of short-term storage in the stream. Sometimes you can see large wood in a stream causing, backwater and swirling and holding that water in the stream reach for a little bit longer. And so we found the most drastic difference in that physical aspect, with more retention time, water spending more time in the restored reach than the concrete channel. We also measured some different chemical aspects. And when I say chemical, think of the periodic table, all of those elements are chemicals. And so we were looking at some nutrients that I've already mentioned before, phosphorus and nitrogen in particular. And we were curious, are one of these two stream reaches processing these nutrients more efficiently, concrete channel or the restored channel? And we found that it just depended on the nutrient. So again, as I said, streams are often multifaceted when it comes to trying to pinpoint what's going on in them. So phosphorus and nitrogen both had a shorter, I'm trying to think of how to explain the concept of spiraling length. So if you think of an individual nutrient molecule going downstream, how far does it go downstream before something takes it out of the water, whether that's algae or maybe bacteria? And we refer to that as the spiraling length.
How do you measure that?
So we drip in nutrients. We actually elevate the nutrients in the stream, but just a little bit above background. So you put in nutrients, and then you measure the decline in that nutrient concentration downstream. So that's demonstrating that those nutrients are being taken up.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's really fun, sort of gets at the dynamics of the stream, right? Instead of just going and measuring like, oh, what's the algae today? This is a dynamic that takes time into consideration. So how far, how long do these nutrients stay in the water? How many nutrients are taken up per area of the stream bottom? But we found kind of mixed results there, because the concrete channels actually took up quite a few nutrients because they were blanketed in algae.
Oh, wow.
And so those algae were taking up a lot of nutrients just for their own growth. And so, this again kind of gets at this thorny issue when it comes to restoration. And you sort of alluded to this in your question. What are we restoring for? Are you restoring for a more natural hydrology? You want the water dynamics to be more natural? Well, then the restoration's worked. Are you doing this restoration for sort of nutrient management, right? There's a lot of efforts, especially in more agricultural areas where there's a lot of nutrients, to try to limit the amount of nutrients flowing downstream. And in that case, algae are good. Algae take nutrients out of the water. But then if we keep going down the steps of, what an ecosystem includes, you eventually get to fish. Fish are something a lot of people enjoy, especially, even just as even just to see fish in a stream is pretty awesome. And then other people like to angle for them and eat them. If there's a stream that's blanketed in algae, it might be taking up a lot of nutrients, but that species of algae, that really hairy filamentous algae, is not going to pass energy up the food web, because there's nothing that will eat that. No macroinvertebrates or stream bugs that would eat this really hairy algae to then provide enough bugs to feed the fish. So if you want to try to restore a stream for fish, then you've really got to think about the habitat that's there. Do you have pools and riffles? Do you have large wood where the smaller, younger fish can hide and not be eaten by the larger fish? So it's pretty complex, and it always depends on, what the end goal of the work is.
So I'm actually incredibly excited that you brought that up, specifically the
Fish?
habitat. Yeah, well, I
Yeah.
love fishing, but just in general, because I was going to follow up asking about invertebrates and aquatic organisms, and are they an indicator of habitat quality or stream quality? And then furthermore, should we be looking at the substrate of a stream and, oh, well, this stream doesn't have any plants for the wildlife that we would like to see there, so that's another layer of the restoration that we're missing?
Yeah. Macroinvertebrates are really great indicators of stream health. There are certain species, and in fact, certain families of macroinvertebrates that can do really well in poor water quality conditions. And so if you take a sample, or you notice that a stream has pretty low diversity, dominated by things like flies, like dipterans is the family of flies, that might indicate that the water quality is not very good, because that particular family of bugs can really withstand a wide range of water quality. But if you see other things like stoneflies, mayflies, dragonflies, the larvae, that is, right, the larvae that live in the stream, if you're seeing those, then those families of aquatic bugs are usually indicating better water quality. They all breathe through gills, and so they need a certain amount of oxygen. They need a certain temperature, and also they need a certain temperature range, right? Oftentimes urban streams can get really warm during the day and really cold at night, just depending on, how sunny it is or what the air temperature is. So oftentimes there's a lot of variability in water temperature in urban streams, or it might just be on the hot end, especially in the warmer summer months. And these more sensitive bug species would not survive that. So invertebrates, macroinvertebrates, as we refer to them, the stream bugs, are really good indicators of stream health, and especially if you're noticing a diverse collection or if you're noticing a predominance of just one or two types of invertebrate, then that might indicate poor health.
Are there any steps that you would take? Like, all right, I showed up to a stream restoration site, never been here before, no prior knowledge. What are the first things you're looking for to kind of get an eye test of the quality or the restoration potential for a site?
I think if I were to look around, I would try to look to see where the water level has been during a recent flood, right? So you might see sort of like a tide line on the beach, along a coastal, along the ocean or something. You would see how far did the seaweed get pushed up. I'd look around to see how far has trash gone up. Is this or sticks, logs? Can you see where the flood waters have gone? And then I would think about, you could see if the banks are eroding. Are the banks sloughing? Are they just kind of breaking off down into the stream? Is there vegetation along the stream to hold it, as we talked about earlier? What's the sediment look like on the bottom, right? Do you have a variety? Do you have sand, maybe some mucky, muddy spots, but then also some pebbles and gravel? That demonstrates that there's a variety of habitats, especially when we're thinking at the level of the bugs, right? If a stream is entirely sand, or if a stream is full of just fine sediment muck, that is not going to be able to support a very diverse community of organisms. We refer to that as stream armoring. When too much fine sediment gets in and kind of plugs all the holes in the gravel and the rocks, it becomes armored, right? It's impenetrable because all that soil is now stuck in the stream bottom. So those would be some quick things I'd look for, right? Is how think about the physical template of the stream, right? So if you're just to go and observe without trying to collect any bugs or fish, is this stream diverse in terms of its physical aspects, or is it kind of one and the same, just like a straight shot channel, all sand, nothing on the stream banks? That would be one extreme, versus a channel that has a little bit of meandering, some pool riffle sequences. That's usually a natural. That will indicate that the stream's pretty natural if there's a sequence of pools and riffles going downstream. How high has it flooded? Yeah.
So there are some government programs that are trying to incentivize people to do restorations along streams. In Missouri, we have, stream bank stabilization projects for really eroded locations. They've also got cost share programs for field borders, which is great for upland bird habitat and things like that. But we also know that field borders contribute a filtering effect. Do you think that those programs are moving in the right direction? And if we incorporated those programs more widely, do you think we would see a significant positive result? Or do you think there's still a long ways to go in regards to our understanding of what works and what doesn't?
Great question. First, I just recalled too, since you mentioned the federal programs, there is a rapid habitat assessment that a lot of state governments, like the DNRs of various states, use to rapidly assess the habitat of a stream. And it's basically a checklist. And what does this look like? And you can get a score. So I would use that too if I showed up to a stream to think about what its habitat is.
Is that publicly available?
It should be, yeah. I could find that link for you. And
I would love to put it in the description of the video. So if we find that, I'll throw that out there so other people could take a look at it and use it.
Yeah, that's great. So your question was about these programs by state or federal government agencies to try to get more people to restore or improve their stream habitat.
It makes it more accessible. But the question I guess the question I have is like, put accessibility to the side for a second and just to, do these programs, are they in the right direction? Does what they actually support, field borders and some of these stabilization projects, are those what we need, or are there other things that maybe are under researched that you're kind of working on? Because I know you guys at
Mm,
Northland, your freshwater innovation center, so you guys are looking at
yeah.
the new stuff in freshwater. So I'm curious, like, are we looking at what it is and this is what we got to do, or are there things we need to evaluate going forward on changing our thought process?
I think if you're talking about a thought process, so I couldn't speak to the program specifically,
Sure.
but based on your description, if we get people doing things around their stream reaches, is that the direction we should go, right? And I think we often take for granted our water resources, right? As I said at the top about growing up in Wisconsin with all these lakes, you take that for granted. And I think that some people, yourself included, as a landowner, you've got a water resource on your property, right? And I think that if these programs incentivize people to acknowledge and recognize streams, rivers, ponds, lakes, wetlands that might be adjacent to or on property that they own, I think that that's a big win, right? To start to understand these systems, and especially as we've talked about a few times now, just understand the interconnectedness, right? That the actions you take on your property are going to impact properties downstream, whether that's in a good way or maybe a negative way. And so I think that any program that gets people to just think about their streams, rivers, lakes, ponds, wetlands a little bit more and understand those interconnectedness, even if it's a wetland you might think is disconnected from people downstream, right? There is no downstream with a wetland. But if people are more attuned to all of the services that wetland provides, right? Like, I would wonder if the people haven't, done something as simple as surveyed the birds that visit on a 12-month cycle. They might be astonished to note how many different species come to the wetland, because those are really important habitats for, for food and energy for birds and other organisms. So I think any program that gets people more connected to the freshwater resources in their either in their direct neighborhood, like on their property, but also just in their city or in their watershed, right? Just to start to understand this interconnectedness. I think that would be a win. And I think that's part of the issue, right? Everyone feels like, oh, that little thing that I can jump across in my yard, that little stream, doesn't matter what I do here, right? There's some places in Iowa where you can see cows, cooling off in these small streams in the summer. And then, of course, there's a lot of fecal matter that would go downstream from those cows in the streams in the summer. And that impacts the communities downstream, right? So, yeah. So
Okay.
that's my sort of more general response to, would a government program that gets people to act on any water bodies that they may own or be a part of, would that be beneficial? And I think it would.
So does it take much? I mean, does it take, we got to do all 9 of these checklist items to restore this stream bank to make a significant impact? Or can we see small steps and not even that many of them to actually improve the stream?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, depends on what you're measuring as the response. Are you trying to bring back trout? Well, then you might need 9 things to get the water just right. But of course, trout need cold water, so it needs to be a cold water stream to begin with, right? So what is the goal that you're trying to accomplish, right? Are you trying to reduce the flooding or in your yard? Are you trying to stabilize the stream banks? There are certain things that can definitely get you to check that box, right? Like, yes, we stabilize their stream banks. That would benefit people downstream because then they're not getting all this soil going downstream that can, as I said, lead to armoring of the stream bed, causing less habitat for aquatic bugs. So I think that there are certain individual steps that can be done. I think that a larger sort of portfolio of things might be necessary in some cases. Case in point there is we're doing some work in Polk County, Iowa, which is where Des Moines is. And one of my colleagues was able to get several landowners on the same page and pay for 1.5 miles of stream to get all saturated buffers installed. So in central Iowa, there's a lot of tile drainage. Tile drainage are pipes that are placed underground under the field to lower the water table so that crops like corn can grow. And these pipes, essentially, they're perforated. So as the water table creeps up or as rain percolates down, they hit these pipes and then get off the landscape pretty quickly into streams. The way to make that process a little bit longer, so water isn't just going directly into the stream from the field, is to cut that pipe off, even just maybe 8 feet short of the stream, and let that water run through the buffer or the stream bank. Don't leave 8 feet between the field and the stream of just grasses. And if the pipe stops there, it's going to take that water a long time to go through the bank and the soil, right, at this microscopic scale, versus just having 8 more feet of pipe that the water can shoot through. So my colleague was able to get all those pipes on 1.5 miles of stream replaced with saturated buffers. There were 26 tile outlets in just 1.5 miles, to give you an idea of the scope of this. They replaced all of them with saturated buffers and saw next to no improvement in the amount of nitrogen that was flowing through the stream.
Wow. So you got to do a lot.
That was for a couple different reasons, so again, nothing is exactly straightforward in with dealing with streams, but part of it was that it was just a really wet spring. And so the farmers don't want their fields flooded. That's the whole purpose behind tile drainage. And so some of the stop logs, you have a stop log to have that water hit the stop log and then saturate the buffer. The stop logs were lowered so that water during the high flow can get out. And that's really the period when a lot of the nitrate's moving. So these projects can work, but as we're finding in this project, they work 10.5 months a year. But then there's those 6 weeks, 1.5 months a year, where you can't flood your field. So you've got to let the water go, but that's also coincides with the time when the most nitrogen is going with it. So
does the 10 months outweigh the 6 weeks, or do we find no? Okay.
No.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Unfortunately not. Yeah.
And it also becomes more expensive to treat the water, when we see these excess nutrients. So not only is it just like, oh, we're helping the habitat, but it's also like taxpayers are paying for their water to be treated downstream somewhere. And most likely in most watersheds, eventually somebody pulls the water out for some public use or something like that. And, that ultimately increases the cost of that service, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yep. And it's just, that the cost of water quality is paid for by somebody, right? And this gets into the whole environmental economics of externalities, right? What are the external costs that aren't considered in the items we purchase or pay for on a daily basis? And one of those is, clean air, clean water.
So what are some of the, in your opinion, what are some of the largest issues facing freshwater conservation right now? And has what we've talked about covered a little bit of that, or are there problems that we haven't even touched on that are even bigger and even more insurmountable?
Yeah, I think a lot about water quantity and quality. And so I think about, this past winter, California and other states out west just were slammed with so many storms and so much precipitation, right? There's these atmospheric rivers, they refer to them. So thinking about the water cycle, one step in the water cycle is water vapor being in the atmosphere. And in recent years, this phenomenon has been growing stronger of these high water vapor dense streams of air flowing east from the Pacific towards the West Coast. And these have been referred to as atmospheric rivers. So there are meteorologists who are trying to get better at predicting when these are going to come, and what are the conditions that need to set up over the Pacific that cause these. So that's really fascinating. And we're seeing just an amazing amount of water quantity in an area that's undergone 20 plus years of drought. So the one thing that I think of sometimes is that thanks to the water cycle, we have more water being renewed by evaporation, condensation, and precipitation every year than what the entire human population uses on an annual basis. Of course, that's really important because we still want water to be in our rivers and streams and lakes, right? So it's good that we're using less. But one of the major issues that is becoming more acute in our society is that the distribution of that water is not evenly distributed as to where humans live.
Right.
Right. And so I think that is going to become more of an issue, right? Here I am on the shores of Lake Superior, the biggest freshwater lake in the world, and it's very low population density in all the surrounding counties around this entire huge lake, right? So Duluth, Minnesota is the biggest city, maybe Thunder Bay, Ontario, but it's just a very sparsely populated area. Whereas then there are, some mega cities in the U.S. Southwest, also in parts of the Middle East, and other places where water is just less available. And so I see that as, one of these major issues is water distribution. Are we going to start to recycle water? Oftentimes the stat, if you remember it from class a couple years ago, Sam, what just floors me is that here in the U.S. we're spending so much on water treatment, right? Which you already said has an associated economic cost. And the amount of water that is treated to drinking water quality, but is actually consumed is only 1 to 3% of that water. So 97 to 99% of the water that we could drink because it's been treated to be drinking water quality, we use for our laundry, we use for our toilets, we use for our showers, our sinks, our garden hoses, washing our cars, industry within our country. We are using such high quality water. And then there's other countries where you shouldn't drink what comes out of the tap, right? Whereas we can drink what we're putting fires out with. So in general, so that's something that really, always when I think of that, it drives me a little crazy. And I try to really, I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, and when they're leaving that faucet running while they're washing their hands or something, just like turn off the faucet in between uses, but
well, that raises another question. Does the personal use component, like on an individual basis, matter more, or are there other facets going into this whole thing, like companies, pollution, things like that? Kind of walk me through your philosophy on the individual use versus large scale.
Yeah, I think with all environmental things, even going beyond water, recycling and, trying to drive less, walk or bike more, all of these individual choices we make do matter. The things that would create more change would be, I think, and have discussed this with others too, thinking about more systemic change in our culture, right? So we as individuals have a lot of purchasing power, and as consumers of goods and services can sway larger entities like corporations or industry, right? And so I think that's where we can make an even more meaningful impact, right? So we can all do better on water use, for instance, or fossil fuel use, but where we can make the largest impact, and where I think we need to make the largest impact to see bigger change, is sort of the collective, collective action as consumers, right? What are the products we're purchasing? People often ask me like, "Oh, is bottled water safe? Can you drink bottled water?" And I just think, like, why do you want to pay for that cheap plastic bottle? Because you're paying for it, and whatever company you're buying that from is already making profits hand over fist, because the water they're getting is really cheap. And oftentimes, in some cases, some of those bottled water companies are just using municipal water, and they're bottling it themselves and selling it. So imagine, just starting your own little outfit and buying a bunch of plastic bottles and filling them at your tap, right? That is what some companies do. So buy a reusable water bottle. Don't consume that plastic. Don't be part of the chain that, the fossil fuel chain, that water is bottled somewhere and it's trucked somewhere else. And then there's distribution centers and it's trucked from there. When the water coming out of your tap is very likely safe to drink. We still have some issues in our country, especially around social justice, where there are some communities that are often disproportionately Black or Latino or lower income, that water quality is not as good as it should be, and is in other surrounding municipalities. The example that comes to mind is Flint, Michigan. East Palestine, Ohio, just is going through a lot right now, with the train derailment that happened in February, right? That was a major environmental catastrophe, right, that affected the water. And that community is lower on the socioeconomic scale. And so I was glad to see that they did get attention, but that attention came a little bit late, right? So it's a long way to say, I think we have some direct impacts we can make. And it is important to make those, but I think we even have more power as consumers, right?
Yeah.
And just word of mouth, right?
Do you think water is like the biggest? I mean, you're obviously biased because you're a freshwater ecologist, but there's energy, there's water, there's land use and agriculture. Do you think water is kind of like the principal resource that we can look at and go, once we conserve water, it trickles down to a lot of these other things?
Yeah, you bring up a great, you hit on what I would say is the food, energy, water nexus, right? We talk a lot about that because they're also interrelated, right? If you think of like a sphere of food, that's going to overlap with energy. It's going to overlap with water. And similarly, water and energy overlap as well. And so it's really important when we think about those different aspects to realize how interconnected they are. When it comes to water, for instance, one of the things that I always enjoy, both in class, but also in outreach that I've done, is, I bring a bag of oranges that, I consume at home. And sometimes I'll pass them out to the group. And as people are eating them, I ask what they think of the sensations with the orange. And of course, one of the most frequent sensations with oranges is that they're juicy, right? You're getting the juice from them. And that juice, of course, is water. And where did the water come from? Well, you've got to look at the bag. Most of our citrus is from California, some from Florida. And so therefore, just by consuming an orange, you are consuming water from a totally different watershed, hundreds, if not thousands of miles from where you live. And so this concept is known as virtual water, right? There's water inside so many of our goods and services, including like all of the mining that goes into cell phones and the rare earth elements in there. And so there's sort of a cost of water for everything that we consume. The most obvious is our food, right? And of those, the more obvious ones are like oranges or things, but even coffee. Coffee is a pretty water intensive plant. And so that, and then the whole production process and roasting of coffee uses water. So food, energy, and water is all really closely connected. And I think, making informed consumer decisions is important. And that can, it'd be hard for me to say which one's, more important than the others. I would say that, if you think about the rule of three is, you can survive only about 3 minutes without breathing. And you can only survive about 3 days without drinking, but you could go 3 weeks or so without eating. Not that I recommend any of those. But that would suggest that I guess air is most important and water is a close second, right?
Sure.
We really do need to be consuming water just for our own health and metabolism of our bodies. Yeah.
Well, one thing I think about, in general ecology, we talk about trophic cascades and how if one, for example, if one species goes extinct and that species is critical to an ecosystem, it could collapse. And so when you were talking about that, I kind of thought about water in the same way. Like water has a cascading effect, and the water quality or the water dynamics has a cascading effect on everything, not only downstream, but around the stream as well. When you think of the Sahara Desert, the typical image of water is a bunch of lions and elephants and everything gathering around the watering pool, and everybody's there and everybody's cool because they know that it's the only water they've got. But, extrapolate that to the Midwest where we have actually an abundance of water, relatively speaking, and maybe we take that for granted, like you said earlier, but we don't consider the cascading effects that water quality, quantity, and things like that play into the surrounding ecosystems or communities as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think another thing we really take for granted is just turning on the tap and taking a swig of what comes out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think about that a lot. We've certainly taken advantage of that resource and done some amazing things. But, as someone who's also been to a small country in Africa, just like you have in Ghana, they use a lot of reusable glass bottles out there. I don't know if they have the same thing in Ghana, but when I went to Rwanda, they had that where everybody uses old Fanta and Coke bottles, and they take them to recycling centers and disinfect them. And although that doesn't directly matter in regards to like water conservation, it's an interesting thing where like even these smaller developing countries that don't even have like water abundance are still doing these things that we look at each other like this is common sense, but we can't figure out a way to make it stick here.
Yeah. Yeah. But bottled water will always sort of confuse me. Why people would drink bottled water. I mean, it's kind of personal preference, but really, what you get out of the tap is the same quality in most every case.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what projects are you working on right now? In 2020, you published the research from Madison. I know you're working on publishing the research from Iowa and the 4 Mile, was it 4 Mile Creek that you're talking about?
Yep. 4 Mile Creek and Walnut Creek. Yep.
So now that you're kind of in the publishing process of that, are you working on data collection and anything like that for a project that's going to come out in a couple years?
Yeah, I hope to. I'm just getting my feet on the ground here. I've been here in northern Wisconsin at the Burke Center for about a year. And the project that we're kicking off in the next few weeks, in fact, is getting some real-time sensors on buoys in a couple lakes that are at the very edge of the Mississippi River watershed, which is pretty exciting. And so what we're going to do is put buoys out in 3 different lakes, and on each buoy, we're going to have about $10,000 worth of equipment or so. Actually $14,000 now that I think about it. So $14,000 of equipment on these 3 buoys. People, whether they're members of the lake association of the lake they're on, or even you down in Missouri, could look at these data in real time to see what is the lake, what are the conditions of the lake right now. And that's really exciting because I'm as with the work in Iowa, I'm excited to be doing work in a human landscape, right? I mean, there are people everywhere. Some ecologists, I think, are still, really want to study what are the dynamics of natural ecosystems. But to me, humans have had an impact everywhere, right? So rather than focus on sort of natural dynamics of pristine ecosystems, what are the dynamics of the ecosystems that we are in? We saw during the COVID lockdown that so many more people started recreating outside, which is great. But one of the ideas that came from that was, are we loving our natural places to death, right? A lot of national parks, state parks, they were just overrun with people. It's great that people are out there, but sometimes too many people can damage those ecosystems, or some irresponsible people aren't going to treat those natural ecosystems with respect, sort of to leave no trace. They're leaving a lot of trace. And so that's something I'd like to think about up here as well, is there's a couple streams and rivers where there's a lot of tubing and canoeing. So those are sort of the two projects I'm thinking about, both getting these buoys out in 3 different lakes to just start conversations with people in the area, look at data trends through time, and then also looking at human impacts on these freshwater resources, either through recreation. What are recreation impacts, or what is our impact on how these streams and rivers and lakes function?
So how did you develop that project? Was this just like somebody had the technology and we need to put it to use, or did you kind of think of the problem and try and devise a way to just figure it out over time?
Yeah, so it's kind of the first thing you said, is that we had some equipment, and we had some property on Northland College has some property on one of these lakes that we'll put a buoy on. So we'd like to utilize that system more. So that kind of prompted the buoy research, and then sort of my own internal questions and discussions with colleagues about visitor use impacts kind of generated the leads into that second part. So a little bit of both.
Nice. Do you have a
Yeah.
hypothesis, or what do you think is going to ultimately result from the start of this project? And do you kind of have any sense of, where you're going to take it in the future?
Yeah. So what's interesting about these lakes here is that they are a little bit stained with organic carbon. So those are like brown water systems, right? So if you ever see a lake that is brown water but kind of clear, that's dissolved organic carbon. So I'm not talking about like the chocolate milk you might see because there's a lot of sediment or dirt in the water, but rather the clear but brown water, kind of like tea, right? So a lot of the lakes here have that dark staining because there's a lot of wetlands in the watershed around the lakes, and those wetlands are leaching out a lot of this carbon material. And so what's really fascinating about these systems is that they don't have a lot of algae because light's not going very deep in brownish water. So there's not a lot of algae. And of course, algae are the base of the food web. So whatever algae you do have kind of dictates how many, zooplankton, small invertebrates you'd have, which then dictates your sort of forage fish, and then dictates your game fish. And so what I'm really fascinated about is how these systems are going to change with climate change and, over the next 5, 10, 15 years. These are pretty sensitive systems, so that a little bit more runoff from the landscape, like if we get more summer precipitation, for instance, could make the waters browner. And there's a whole body of literature on lake browning as a verb, the browning of lakes. And what that could do is it could sort of pinch the zone of the lake where algae are able to survive, because now maybe light is penetrating even less. And what are the ripple effects that's going to have? We don't know, but what effects would that have up the food chain? Also, these lakes are pretty close to neutral, but these dissolved components that are running off the landscape, especially from wetlands, are a little bit acidic.
Mm.
And so these lakes are kind of at a tipping point that if they do get a lot more inputs of the carbon, they could become more acidic. And then if they're highly acidic, then that could totally change the food web as well. So they're pristine systems, but highly vulnerable.
So one
And
thing you
so
mentioned
yeah.
there, we kind of touched on it earlier a little bit, but you talked about the algae in the stream or in the lake, and we talked
Mhm.
earlier about the algae in the stream.
Yep.
Um, is that something that people should be looking at and trying to evaluate, like what algae is there, and does that specific species of algae indicate something about the water system that we're looking at?
Um, I think with algae, it's more quantity, right? I'm thinking about it in terms of quantity. It's such a diverse community often. The one group of algae that may be of concern or interest would be the cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. They can lead to the harmful algal blooms, which have been the acronym for harmful algal blooms is HABs, HABS. Um, so there have been 3 blue-green algal blooms in Lake Superior in the last decade on the South Shore, right near where we are in Ashland, Wisconsin. And those have never been seen before in Lake Superior, which is, of the 5 Laurentian Great Lakes, the biggest, the cleanest, the coldest, and yet we're seeing algal blooms here. You often hear algal blooms associated with Lake Erie, but that's because it's one of the shallowest of the Great Lakes. The Western Basin can really warm up because that's really shallow, and it's getting a lot of phosphorus from the agriculture in Northeast Indiana and Northwest Ohio. So, uh, so that's really unique, right? These lakes. There's a whole body of literature out there that discuss lakes as sentinels of climate change, right? So lakes are collect a lot of information from the watershed, literally, right? That streams and rivers are running into them. Trees are dropping their leaves into them. So they're kind of this mixing pot of the landscape. And then they're also impacted by climate, right? So how long is the ice staying on these lakes into the spring versus when does the ice set up in the fall? And ice off and ice on is those dates are really changing. There's some 100-year records taken by citizen scientists, just people who live on these lakes, and generations of the same family might note when they couldn't cross it anymore, or when they could walk across it in the fall, because it was iced over. So yeah, I think lakes are really important to study. They're really dynamic, but they can also provide, sort of these early warnings as to what's happening both ecologically, but also more broadly,
Nice.
because we as humans use these for a lot, including sustenance, water, etc.
Absolutely. I know that some people have talked about how the decline in prairie has resulted in higher phosphorus levels in uh, the streams because of leaf litter, because the prairies historically would line stream banks, for example, or
Mm-hmm.
the general area around streams, and then they would collect all that leaf litter. The leaf litter would degrade and be absorbed into the grass or for system. But now that we've lost our prairies, or majority of them, a lot of that leaf litter is getting washed into our streams, which is raising phosphorus levels as
Mm-hmm.
well. Are you seeing anything like that, or have you looked into anything like that?
They're doing a lot of those studies, and especially in more populous areas like in Madison, where there's a couple lakes and also just a much larger city. So yeah, that's we have modified our landscape so things do enter these water bodies more quickly, and that's a great example. Yeah.
So I know that a lot of people that are probably listening to this podcast, they're not everybody has a backyard stream or a lake up the street that they can go to and recreate at. And so,
Mhm.
do you have any thoughts on what the average person could do to impact their community in a water related way that doesn't require property ownership or anything along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd go back to the watershed concept and idea, right? We all live in a watershed, even if there isn't one, in sight of where we live, or even, in sight of what you think, because oftentimes, especially in more urban areas, those water bodies are put in sewers and put underground in urban areas like Milwaukee or Chicago, big urban areas. So I would encourage people to just find out where you live, find out what watershed you're in, where is the nearest stream, where does that flow. You've done some good homework on that, Sam, and found out that you're connected to the Mississippi and therefore the Gulf of Mexico. um, and and then find out what information exists on it, right? Every state DNR is required to report to the EPA what the quality of the state's waters are. So every state is monitoring a lot of water within the state. Not every water body, of course, but many. So there's a likelihood that a stream near you has been measured. This is required every 2 years. It's called the 303D list. So you can Google 303D Missouri, 303D Wisconsin, and find out what streams or rivers are in good condition or have some sort of impairments. And then it'll list what those impairments are. So I think finding out, where are you? What watershed are you in? What is the general report card for your state, which you can find on that 303D list. And then find out what you can do to maybe put your nearby stream or river on some sort of public map, right? There's a lot of citizen science monitoring programs. The Isaac Walton League, which is a national nonprofit, they do a lot of stream sampling and can provide like a stream water quality testing kit. So you can start to take part, start to look at how the water bodies around you are changing, either, week to week or month to month, season to season. Streams are really dynamic, and they're just telling sort of this unfolding story as they flow downstream. So I would encourage people just to get out and become aware of the water resources in your area. And then finally, think about what's happening to those water resources, right? Every time a new development is proposed for a city or municipality, there's often a public comment period. Is that going to impact a wetland, or is that going to have some sort of higher discharge amount? What's going to be in that discharge? So what is this potential development going to be putting back into the stream? And just kind of raise your awareness of the water in your local area. And if you can do something for your local area, you're also benefiting those people downstream too, right? So I think that's a really big win and something we can all get behind.
So you mentioned the citizen science portion of it, and in our last episode, we talked about people going out and using plant identification apps, and
Mm,
learning about plants. And it's like, oh, I figured out that I have this wildflower in my backyard. What is it?
yeah.
What good or bad things does it have? Once you identify it, you can Google it, you can look up all the different aspects of that plant. And
Mm.
so, what significance does citizen science have to water resources, and how could somebody like me or an average listener of this podcast contribute to the local knowledge base in regards to water resources?
Just providing a baseline of data on a local waterway, right? So again, if you can get in touch with an organization, maybe in a certain state, maybe DNR supports water quality testing. There was a program formerly in Iowa known as Iowa Water, and that was a citizen science-based program. But maybe at the county level, there are hopefully opportunities for people to get a water quality testing kit and then report the data. And again, that can be really useful when things are being proposed, or maybe there's an opportunity to get funding to create a park or to plant trees, right? So there could be ways to leverage the data to see some actions along the stream, right? And streams are highly variable, which makes them both really exciting to study, but also kind of drives me crazy. So, you can't just take one sample and say, oh, the stream is fine, or, oh my gosh, the stream is really impaired, right? It's the quote that I really like by a Greek philosopher from thousands of years ago, said, "No person steps into the same river twice, for it is not the same river, nor is it the same person." Right. So that water is always flowing downstream. We're always changing and learning new things. So yeah, I think streams and rivers are amazing to study, as are lakes, of course, wetlands and other freshwater bodies. But I think just getting involved and taking an active role in looking around at what's around you and how does that change seasonally.
Yeah, absolutely. Water is one of those things that, you can't see. Sometimes you can't always see what's good or bad. Like
Mm-hmm.
plants, oh, I can see an invasive species or things along that line. But when it comes to the water flowing in your canal or your stream or in the river
Yeah.
down the street, by looking at it, you can't always tell what's wrong with it or if there's anything wrong with it. And conversely, just seeing clear water doesn't mean that the water's good. So, there's so many different things that play into it, and it's certainly one of the more challenging natural resources, I think, to think about in the same conservation mind.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always moving. Lakes are a little bit easier because they're staying in place, but they're also receiving water from the watershed. Yeah.
So, for people that might be looking to one day become uh, freshwater ecologists or hydrologists or just are interested in environmental science in any way, what do you think the future questions that these people should be asking, or what answers should we be looking to find as we go forward? Trying to kind of project out, 10, 15 years from now, what answers do we need to have, or at least be on the right track to finding so that we can make a really positive impact for future generations.
Water recycling.
Yeah.
Pretty straight and clear. Yeah. I mean, we just have to be better. Um, there's, so the concept of water recycling is that, again, most of the water that is treated for consumption is not consumed, but rather goes down our shower drains, our toilets, our garden hoses. And so the idea behind water recycling is capturing that water, which is referred to as gray water. Most of that water is gray water. The water from your toilet is considered black water, needs to be treated, right? Because there are pathogens and bacteria in human waste that needs to be treated and addressed. But not so in laundry, uh,
Right.
the water from laundry or the water from your dishwasher. So, how can we reuse that gray water? Maybe that's what we use to water our lawns. At a bigger scale, at like a municipal scale, um, all those water treatment facilities could pipe water back from the sewage treatment to the water treatment and treat the water to the same quality as what originally came out of your tap. And I think that's a really important thing. This is done on the International Space Station. This is done in some countries like Namibia, which is in Southwest Africa, around the Kalahari Desert. So they don't have a lot of water. The capital, Windhoek, does recycle water. There are some cities in the US, especially in Texas, California, Florida, that are doing this already. Often they're blending just a little bit or none at all, though, with the city water. So taking the sewage treatment water, treating it again. And I think that's really an important aspect of the future. And that could really ease a lot of the water stress that we're seeing in parts of the country and world where there's a lot of people, but there's not a lot of water. So I think the biggest hurdle there is the ick factor, right? Would you drink a glass of water from the tap that you knew was also your city's sewage at one point? Yeah. The treatment process is still the same. So it will be of the same quality as what you originally drank, right? And in a way, all water is recycled, right? Like, what I used to tell fifth graders when I worked environmental education is like, you're drinking dinosaur pee,
I was going to
right?
say, I think we talked about that in
Yeah,
freshman geology class.
Exactly. You know, all the water that's on Earth has been here and just cycling through everything, you know. So the chances that the water you drink today were, you know, who's a famous Missourian from 100 years ago, right? Chances are they might have drank it too, right?
Yeah, George Washington. We've probably
All
all
right.
drank some of George Washington's water from back in the day.
Yeah, potentially. Exactly. I mean, that's an incredible story too, right? You think of all the molecules of water you drink in a day and think of all the amazing journeys they have had.
Oh, absolutely. And,
Yeah.
this is a podcast for another day, but when we were talking earlier about the desalinization of the oceans, it's like
Mm.
once that process, if it ever becomes energy efficient to do that, does that change our relationship with fresh water in the sense that we become, like you're talking about recycling and how that's a crucial, forward progress we need to make. But if we desalinize in an energy efficient way before the recycling issue is solved, does that change the direction that we take with the recycling? Because then we won't need to recycle anymore because we can just suck it out from
Yeah.
the ocean. Which worries me a little bit because
Mhm.
what happens once the ocean level starts going down because we start pouring water into these freshwater lakes, for example, that may or may not ever end up in the ocean if, for whatever reason. So there's a lot to think about, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And with desal too, one of the hiccups is that for every, you know, gallon of fresh water you get a gallon of water that is twice as salty as the ocean.
Mm,
So you've taken the salt from one and put it in the other. So what we could do over time with desalinization, it's not just energy efficiency, but we could be killing the ocean. Um, you know, if we were to take for every gallon again, we're putting
more than we
water
already
that's
are, by the way.
twice as salty. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. So that's another hiccup with desalinization, and that's why recycling water is like more the way that is likely more of the way of the future than desalinization, right? We already have that technology, and there are cities. I think Tampa, Florida, has one of the biggest desalinization plants in the U.S. But it's really expensive, and you've got sort of this waste product of really, really salty water.
Did they just pour it back into the ocean, or?
I'm not sure, but you know, to a certain extent, it'll get diluted, right? But if every major city was doing it, you
Yeah.
know, you're really going to have a localized effect, right? Like,
Right.
what does that do to the immediate surroundings to Tampa if they have a really high volume? Are they going to, you know, kill the fish and or whatnot? So I'm not sure how Tampa deals with it, but it could have a really negative local impact if it's at a high volume.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, do you have any closing thoughts? I know we're getting close to time here, so I just wanted to get your
Yeah.
kind of like last thoughts. Like, do you have anything to tell everybody or things that we haven't touched on that would be key for us to look into in the future or continue to do further research on as we go forward?
Gosh, I think find out where your drinking water comes from, right? Similar to, you know, what watershed do you live in? You know, where does your drinking water come from? Where is the source of that water, right? We talk a lot about source protection. Um, you drive around on some interstates and some states, and it says like now entering a watershed protection area, right? So there are certain areas that are trying to highlight where source water is coming from. I think that's a really important thing just to have the knowledge of. Um, yeah. So just being informed and understanding that there are consequences for our water based on how we treat the land. Um, and that's really important, especially for future generations. You know, with as much water as we consume in a day, whatever is in that water will get into us. There are a lot, you know, one other field of study that's rapidly expanding is pharmaceuticals, personal care products, emerging contaminants. That's kind of the buzzword, is emerging contaminants. So there are things that we use in industrial processes and in our daily lives that are not regulated by EPA. The one that's getting a lot of headlines now is PFAS, which is in a lot of fire retardants. It's also known as a forever chemical, so it does not degrade. So there are a lot of things that might be in our water, depending where you live, that might not be good for us, but there's not enough research. There's not enough regulation on it yet. And that regulatory process is like a decade long, typically for a single chemical.
Yeah.
So that's something else to just be aware of, right? There are typically state hygienic labs in every state. So I know that Iowa had one, Wisconsin has one. So there are places you can send a water sample to from your own personal tap. I would encourage everyone who drinks off of well water to absolutely do that, possibly as much as once a year. The tests, it's usually $20 for one thing. Like if you want to know how much lead is in my water, it's $20. Sometimes you can get a suite of measurements for say $100. And that is a cost, but there's a cost to, personal cost to drinking water that might have stuff in it too. So, I think just being informed and understanding the crucial role that water has in our daily lives and, our daily livelihoods.
Absolutely. Do you think water is going to be one of those things we look back on in 50 years and see all of the different ways we treat it now and go, darn, we should have done it differently?
I would not be surprised. We're already doing that, right? Rivers would catch on fire before the Clean Water Act. So at least that's not happening. But
True.
Yeah, exactly. What are we doing now that we just are hitting our head, we'll be hitting our heads against the wall in the future? Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with me. I think we made a lot of ground, but it certainly have a lot more we could have covered. So we'll probably have to do this again.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Sam. Thanks for the opportunity. And for those of you that were listening, thanks for listening. And Sam knows how to get a hold of me if you have any follow-up questions.
All right, and that wraps up episode 3 of the Living Lands podcast. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions or want to reach out, our contact information and Peter's contact information will be in the description below. Thanks, and have a great rest of your day.